One man chased glory, the other, freedom. They never met face to face, but on one blood-stained hill, their destinies collided. This isn't the story they teach in schools. This is the truth about Crazy Horse, Custer, and the battle that shattered American history. The wind across the Great Plains carries more than dust. It carries names, names whispered like prayer, like warning. Two names echo louder than all the rest. Crazy Horse. Custer. They never stood face to face. They never spoke. They never raised a weapon directly against the other. Yet on a sun-scorched day in June 1876, their lives collided in one of history's most haunting confrontations, etched not in dialogue, but in decisions. Crossed swords, one wore a tailored uniform, the other wore no shirt. George Armstrong Custer rode into the pages of American myth astride a thoroughbred, his golden curls bouncing beneath a wide-brimmed hat. At 36, he had survived the Civil War, been promoted to general at just 23, and was now seeking something else, immortality. The press loved him. Washington praised him. But his men? Some called him reckless. Others called him a glory-hungry gambler. Custer believed in destiny. Specifically, his own. Crazy Horse, in contrast, never let his picture be taken. He wore no feathers, no war paint, no ornaments. He was called Thaswenkwitko by the Lakota, a name meaning, his horse is crazy. He walked like the land itself had raised him. He fought not for fame, but because he had to. For his people. For the sacred hills. For the right to live without chains. Two men, born in different worlds. One embraced the camera. The other ran from it. One dreamt of White House dinners. The other dreamt of buffalo running free. And yet, in the heat of that summer, fate braided their paths together, tight and irreversible. Sheaf of rice, their childhoods were separated by war and belief. Custer was born in Ohio, 1839, to a working-class family. He was a poor student, undisciplined but charming. He graduated last in his class at West Point. But when the Civil War exploded, he rocketed upward. He craved chaos, and chaos rewarded him. By 1868, at the Washita River, Custer led an attack that killed scores of Cheyenne, including women and children. He called it a military victory. Survivors called it a massacre. Among those who would never forget it, were the Northern Cheyenne. Crazy Horse was born around 1840, near the Black Hills, Pahasapa, sacred land of the Lakota. He grew up watching his people pushed westward, promise after promise shattered by white settlers and U.S. treaties written in vanishing ink. He saw wagons cut across buffalo trails. He watched elders displaced from their lodges. He heard tribal songs sung quieter and quieter. And he remembered. By 16, he was already a respected warrior. But unlike others, he refused to wear war paint or ceremonial garb. "The land is my paint," he said. Where Custer saw conquest, Crazy Horse saw invasion. Where Custer dreamed of medals, Crazy Horse dreamed of balance. And when the U.S. government declared that the tribes must return to reservations in 1876, by force, if needed, both men began their final march. Their visions collided at Little Bighorn. Custer wanted a swift, stunning victory. A strike that would force the Sioux and Cheyenne to surrender. A victory to secure his name ahead of a possible political run. He dreamed of headlines. He dreamed of becoming president. Crazy Horse, meanwhile, joined forces with Sitting Bull, Gall, and other leaders to protect what little land remained free. He knew they could not win forever. But maybe, just maybe, they could win once. Just once. Enough to make history look twice before it erased them. They did not know it then. But the next 48 hours would seal them both into legend. One would be lionized in textbooks. The other, buried in shallow memory, his grave hidden, his spirit guarded. The stage was set. Thung Lung Little Bighorn, wide, green, and deceptively peaceful. The land held the stories of 1,000 generations. And now, it would hold one more. A thunderstorm was coming. Not of wind and rain, but of rifles, hooves, and war cries. And at its center stood two men, whose names would never be spoken in the same breath again without a shiver. June 1876. Montana Territory. The sun burned down on dry grass and broken treaties. George Armstrong Custer rode at the head of his column, his buckskin coat dusted with yellow clay. Behind him stretched 600 men of the 7th Cavalry, their faces drawn, horses thin from the long march through hostile plains. In his hands, a flawed map. In his mind, a flawed assumption. And at his heels, the ghost of Washita. He had orders to join General Alfred Terry and Colonel Gibbon in a three-pronged campaign to corner the Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne. But Custer, ever impatient, saw a faster path: go alone. The scouts had warned him. Mitch Boyer, half Crow and half white, had seen the massive trail. Bloody Knife, an Arikara, said the hoofprints were too many for any war party. But Custer wasn't listening. He wanted a decisive strike before the other generals even arrived. He wanted a victory that was his. At dawn on June 25, Lieutenant Charles Varnum and a group of native scouts climbed a ridge known later as Crow's Nest. Below them lay a vision of defiance. Smoke curled from over 1,000 lodges nestled in the Little Bighorn Valley. At least 15,000 horses grazed nearby. And between the lodges and the sky moved 2,000 to 2,500 warriors, armed, alert, and ready. Varnum squinted, stunned. The scout said nothing, just handed him a note to send back to Custer. Large village. Very strong. Advise caution. Custer read the warning and smiled. If we wait, they'll scatter like antelope. He tore the message and divided his forces. 140 men under Major Marcus Reno, to attack from the south. 125 men under Captain Frederick Benteen, to scout the left flank. 210 men with himself, to strike from the north. The pack train, with ammunition, trailed miles behind. 3 separate groups. 1 scattered command. And no clear way to regroup. Meanwhile, in the valley below, Crazy Horse sat in stillness. He had danced the night before in ceremony. He had watched Sitting Bull cut 100 pieces of flesh from his own arms as sacrifice for a vision. And in that vision, Sitting Bull had seen soldiers falling like grasshoppers, their blood staining the ground. Crazy Horse didn't question it. He didn't argue strategy. He simply whispered to his horse and prepared for war. He painted no symbols on his body. He wore no charms. But when he rode, the warriors followed. Among them was Gall, a Hunkpapa chief whose 2 wives and children had been killed by the army years earlier. Gall rode with fury, not just for revenge, but to stop the cycle. We do not seek their land, he had once said. Only that they leave ours. The tribes had gathered unexpectedly, fleeing reservation boundaries, drawn by rumors of war and visions of resistance. This was no war party. This was a nation on the move. Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Lakota, Oglala. Bound not by conquest, but by the common wound of betrayal. And then, they heard the hooves. Reno's column was seen first, dust rising on the southern edge of the camp. Warriors shouted. Children ran. Women moved to safety. But instead of fleeing, the fighters mounted their ponies. They formed lines. They sang the old songs. This time, they would not be hunted. This time, they would be the storm. Custer watched from a northern bluff, waiting for Reno to draw the village's defenders. But what he didn't realize was that Crazy Horse was already in motion. Gall had flanked the southern hills. Crow King rallied hundreds of warriors through the eastern ravines. Cheyenne scouts moved to block retreat paths. The encirclement had begun. And Custer was still convinced he held the upper hand. Back on the ridges, Captain Benteen, ever skeptical, had received his orders. He looked at the map, saw the separation, and frowned. Custer's trying to outshine his own orders again. He moved slowly, too slowly. He would not reach Custer in time. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Custer gave the signal to advance. Below him, Crazy Horse slipped into a ravine, his war party behind him, moving like shadows cast by thunder. One man sought legacy. The other sought liberation. The Great Plains would soon choose which one would walk away. June 25, 1876, 3 p.m. The sky above the little Bighorn Valley shimmered with heat. The cottonwood trees whispered in the wind. And then, came thunder. Not from the sky. From the earth. Hooves. Gunfire. Screams. Major Reno had led his men across the river hours earlier, expecting to strike a scattering village. What he found instead was a wall of resistance. Warriors poured from the lodges, Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, armed with bows, rifles, and generations of rage. They struck from every direction, moving swift and low through ravines like fire chasing dry grass. Reno, shocked by the ferocity, ordered a retreat into the woods. And when even the trees betrayed him, he crossed back over the river in chaos, abandoning 40 dead men in his wake. From the bluffs above, Custer saw the smoke. But he couldn't hear the screams. To the north, Custer's detachment of 210 men had dismounted and advanced along the ridgeline, unaware they were walking into a snare. His scouts were gone. His reinforcements miles away. His pack train, full of ammunition, still crawling behind the hills. And ahead of him, hidden by folds in the land, was Crazy Horse. The Oglala warrior had waited. He'd seen the pattern before, soldiers rushing in, confident, divided. He had told his men, "We will circle them. We will press them like the jaws of the wolf." Now, he moved. Silently. Swiftly. Precisely. Custer's men had formed a skirmish line near Calhoun Hill, but the warriors approached too fast, too close. Winchester rifles, taken from previous battles, rattled like hailstones. Cavalry Springfields, slow to reload, sputtered in return. Within minutes, chaos overtook discipline. Men fell by the dozens. Custer called out orders, but the command structure had fractured. Captains Keogh and Calhoun died where they stood. Trumpeter Henry Voss never even sounded his bugle. One private ran screaming toward the river, only to be cut down by a Cheyenne rider with red paint across his chest. Another tried to hide behind his dead horse. He lasted 20 seconds longer. Custer tried to rally a retreat, but it was too late. The warriors were everywhere, sliding down ravines, riding bareback, whooping with terrifying precision. From behind a low ridge, Crazy Horse rose, riding a pony marked with white lightning strikes across its neck. He didn't shout. He didn't gesture. He charged. A dozen warriors followed him like thunder after lightning. They encircled Custer's final position on Last Stand Hill, cutting off escape, firing from all sides. Custer was struck in the chest. Some say once. Others say twice, once in the chest, once in the head. Either way, he fell, without firing his pistol. When the dust settled, every one of Custer's men lay dead. His body was found stripped, riddled with bullets, but not scalped, some say out of respect, others out of pity. The sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the ridge. Crazy Horse dismounted, walked among the dead. He said nothing. Just stared at the destruction. He had won the greatest native victory in U.S. history. But it did not feel like victory. He knew the army would return. They would bring more men. More rifles. More railroads. And this moment, powerful as it was, would not stop the tide. It would only slow it. He looked to the horizon. Somewhere beyond the ridges, his people were singing the morning songs. And somewhere in Washington, Custer's death would become myth, a martyrdom that erased his arrogance and glorified his defeat. June 26, 1876. The battlefield lay quiet. Buzzards circled above the scorched hilltops. Smoke drifted through cottonwood branches like morning spirits. The last song of Custer's men had already been sung, by thunder, by hooves, by gunfire. All that remained now were bodies. And a silence that would echo for centuries. When the U.S. Army found the dead 3 days later, the scene was more than a military disaster. It was a national wound. Custer's corpse was found lying beside his brother, Tom. His body was pierced, bloated, stripped, but curiously, not scalped. No jewelry was stolen. No limbs mutilated. Why? Some believe the warriors recognized his bravery. Others say Crazy Horse himself gave the order. Let him lie. He's already gone. But in Washington, truth gave way to narrative. Newspapers wept for Custer. Artists painted him in defiant glory, revolver raised to the last. Monuments rose in his name. He was not remembered as the man who ignored warnings. Who split his own command. Who underestimated a nation defending its home. He was remembered as a fallen hero. And Crazy Horse. There would be no statues. No portraits. Not even a grave. His tribe buried him in secret, fearing desecration. He had lived and died without ever being photographed. Even his name was sacred, spoken only in ceremony. But the Lakota knew. The Cheyenne remembered. And the hills still whispered his story when the wind blew right. Balance scale: 2 legacies. 2 truths. Custer's legacy was etched in granite. Crazy Horse's legacy was written in firelight and oral memory. One was celebrated in textbooks. The other, hidden from them. Yet both were victims. Custer, of his ambition. Crazy Horse, of his resistance. The months after Little Bighorn brought vengeance. The U.S. government doubled its efforts. Within a year, most of the great Sioux and Cheyenne leaders had surrendered or been killed. Sitting Bull fled to Canada. Gall was forced onto a reservation. And in September 1877, Crazy Horse was stabbed in the back by a soldier, while under a white flag of truce. He died whispering in Lakota. Only the rocks live forever. The land they fought over, Pahasapa, the Black Hills, was later flooded with miners, tourists, and Mount Rushmore. The treaties that promised it to the Sioux, in perpetuity, were voided. And the U.S. Supreme Court would later rule. Yes, the land was stolen. But no, it would not be returned. The echoes of Little Bighorn became quiet. But they never faded. Speech balloon. So what do we remember? Custer, the general who gambled with lives, remains on postage stamps. Crazy Horse, the warrior who refused to kneel, remains in shadows. But every June, when the sun scorches the Montana earth just as it did that day, some say they still ride. They say a golden-haired man in blue looks down a valley he never understood. And a silent rider with no paint waits in the cottonwoods. Watching. Waiting. Not for war. But for truth. They never met. They never spoke. But in one day, they defined each other. One man's fame was his downfall. The other's silence, his immortality.